Sir, I haven't eaten for 2 days. I don't want charity. Can I clean your house for just one plate of food?
Young man, come inside. No one should have to beg for food. Come in.
The young man had not eaten for 2 days. Every step felt heavier than the last as the scorching afternoon sun beat down on his shoulders. Hunger had become more than an empty feeling. It had become a constant ache that clouded his thoughts and weakened his legs. Yet pride refused to let him stretch out his hand for money. When he finally stopped in front of the largest mansion he had ever seen, he whispered a sentence that would forever change 2 lives. "Can I clean your house for a plate of food?" He expected rejection. Instead, destiny was listening. Before we continue, take a second to subscribe, like this video, and let us know where you're watching from. Stories like this remind us that hope often arrives in the most unexpected way. At 19, Gabriel had already experienced more hardship than many people twice his age. His father had died after a long illness, leaving behind unpaid debts instead of savings. 6 months later, his mother also passed away, leaving him completely alone. He moved from one temporary job to another, carrying cement at construction sites, washing buses, unloading market trucks, and doing anything that could earn enough money for a meal. Whenever one job ended, another disappointment followed. Despite everything, Gabriel had made one promise to himself. He would never steal. He would never deceive anyone. If he was going to survive, it would be through honest work. That promise became harder to keep each passing day. 3 days earlier, the tiny restaurant where he washed dishes had closed unexpectedly. The owner apologized but had no money left to pay the workers. Gabriel walked away with only a handshake and empty pockets. The little bread he had bought with his last earnings disappeared quickly. By the second day, he drank only water from public taps. Now, standing before the magnificent mansion, desperation finally defeated embarrassment. The property looked like something from a movie. Perfect green lawns stretched across the compound. Expensive cars sparkled under the sunlight. Colorful flowers lined the driveway. Everything screamed wealth. A stern security guard stepped forward. "What do you want?" Gabriel swallowed. "I don't need money. If there's any cleaning, gardening, washing, anything at all, I'll do it for just one plate of food." The guard stared at him for several seconds. Most people who came begging demanded cash. This young man was asking for work. Without another word, the guard pressed the intercom. Inside the mansion, 65-year-old billionaire Mason Wellington was finishing a business meeting when the interruption came. "Sir," the guard said, "there's a young man outside asking if he can clean the house in exchange for food." The room fell silent. One executive chuckled. Another shook his head. Mason did neither. Instead, he stood slowly and walked toward the window overlooking the front gate. He saw a thin young man standing respectfully with both hands clasped in front of him. There was desperation in his eyes. But there was dignity too. That combination reminded Mason of someone he had not thought about in decades. Himself. Long before private jets and boardrooms, he had once slept on cold concrete and searched restaurant bins for leftovers. Nobody in the room knew that story, not even his closest executives. Mason quietly dismissed everyone. "I'll handle this myself." Outside, Gabriel prepared to leave. He had already convinced himself the answer would be no. Then the massive gate began to open. The elderly billionaire walked out alone. The security guards looked surprised. So did Gabriel. Mason smiled gently. "So," he asked, "you're willing to work for food?" Gabriel nodded immediately. "Yes, sir." "What if the work is harder than you expect?" "I'll still do it." "What if it takes all day?" "I'll still do it." "What if I ask you to come back tomorrow too?" Gabriel smiled for the first time in days. "I'll be grateful." Mason's eyes softened. "Come inside." Gabriel stepped through the enormous gate without realizing he was walking into the beginning of a completely different life. He had come searching for one meal. He was about to discover that kindness has a strange way of multiplying. Little did either of them know that hidden inside that mansion was a family secret waiting to surface. A secret connected to an old photograph, an unfinished promise, and a letter that had remained unopened for more than 20 years. The moment Gabriel crossed the doorway, fate quietly turned another page. Gabriel could hardly believe what had just happened. Only an hour earlier, he had stood outside the mansion wondering whether he would survive another day without food. Now he sat at a long dining table covered with dishes whose names he did not even know. His hands trembled as he reached for the bread. Mason Wellington noticed immediately. "Eat slowly," the elderly billionaire said with a warm smile. "No one is taking it away." Those simple words nearly brought Gabriel to tears. He bowed his head before eating, whispering a quiet prayer for the parents he still missed every single day. Mason pretended not to notice, but something about the young man's gratitude touched a place in his heart that had remained closed for years. After the meal, Gabriel insisted on keeping his promise. "I came here to work." Mason nodded. "Good. Honest people keep their word." The housekeeper handed Gabriel gloves and simple cleaning tools. Instead of assigning him impossible chores, she showed him the neglected greenhouse at the back of the estate. Once filled with flowers planted by Mason's late wife, it had slowly become forgotten after her passing. As Gabriel pulled weeds and swept broken leaves, he treated every corner with unusual care. He was not cleaning for a reward anymore. He was restoring something that had once been loved. Hours later, Mason walked into the greenhouse. For the first time in years, he smiled while standing there. "It looks alive again," Gabriel answered quietly. "Some places only need someone to believe they're worth saving." The sentence stopped Mason in his tracks. It sounded strangely familiar. That evening, Mason offered Gabriel temporary work around the estate, along with a small room in the staff quarters. "You've earned more than a meal." Gabriel accepted with gratitude, promising he would work harder than anyone else. Not everyone welcomed the decision. Victor, Mason's ambitious nephew, arrived the following morning. He expected to inherit the billionaire's fortune one day and disliked anything that changed the routine. When he learned that a homeless teenager had been invited to stay on the property, he laughed. "So now we're adopting strangers?" Mason ignored the remark. Victor, however, did not ignore Gabriel. From that day forward, he searched constantly for mistakes. He mocked Gabriel's clothes. He criticized the way he walked. He even accused him of trying to impress the old man for money. Gabriel never argued. Instead, he worked harder. The gardeners soon noticed that flowers bloomed faster in areas Gabriel cared for. The drivers appreciated his willingness to help wash the vehicles after finishing his own duties. Even the cooks secretly packed extra food for him because he thanked them every single day. Within weeks, almost everyone liked him. Everyone except Victor. One rainy afternoon, Gabriel entered the mansion carrying freshly cut flowers for the dining room. A framed photograph slipped from a shelf and landed face down on the carpet. He quickly picked it up. The picture showed a much younger Mason standing beside his wife and a little boy. Behind the photograph rested an old unopened envelope. Gabriel hesitated. He had no intention of reading someone else's private letter. Just then, Mason entered the room. Instead of becoming angry, he slowly took the envelope from Gabriel's hands. "I've been afraid to open this for 22 years. Gabriel looked surprised. "You don't have to tell me about it, sir." Mason smiled sadly. "One day, I will." That night, Mason sat alone in his study staring at the envelope. Memories flooded back. The laughter of his son. The terrible argument. The accident. The silence that followed. He had built a business empire, but he had never found peace. Outside, thunder rolled across the sky. Inside the staff quarters, Gabriel opened the small backpack that held everything he owned. Among the worn clothes was the faded photograph of his parents. He smiled at it before placing it carefully beneath his pillow. He never noticed that the family name written on the back had begun to fade. The next morning, Victor made his move. He quietly slipped an expensive gold watch beneath Gabriel's mattress. Minutes later, he shouted loud enough for everyone to hear, "My watch is missing!" The entire household gathered. Victor insisted every room be searched. Gabriel watched silently as the staff entered his room. His heart pounded. Seconds later, one of them pulled out the missing watch. Gasps filled the hallway. Victor folded his arms with fake disappointment. "I knew it." Mason stared at Gabriel. The room became painfully quiet. Gabriel could barely speak. "I didn't take it." No one knew whom to believe. Mason looked at the frightened young man whose honesty had never once wavered. Then he looked at his own nephew. Finally, he gave an unexpected instruction. "Nobody leaves this house." Victor smiled confidently. He believed his plan had worked perfectly. He had no idea that a small security camera hidden above the corridor had recorded everything. And when Mason asked for the footage, the truth was about to destroy far more than a lie. The truth appeared on the security monitor in painful silence. Victor slipped into Gabriel's room, glanced over both shoulders, and pushed the gold watch beneath the mattress. A few minutes later, he returned to the hallway wearing the expression of a man who had just discovered a crime rather than created one. Nobody spoke as the footage ended. Victor's smile vanished. "Uncle, I can explain." Mason did not raise his voice. Somehow, that made his anger more frightening. "Explain why you tried to destroy an innocent young man's name." Victor opened his mouth, but no clever answer came. He had spent his entire life talking his way out of trouble. This time, the camera had spoken first. Gabriel stood near the doorway, pale and shaken. He had survived hunger, homelessness, and loss, but the accusation had wounded him differently. Poverty had taken his comfort. Victor had tried to take his character. Mason turned to him. "Gabriel, I owe you an apology. This happened under my roof." Gabriel swallowed hard. "You believe me enough to check the truth, sir. That is more than many people would have done." The answer struck Mason deeply. Gabriel had been humiliated, yet he was still grateful for the smallest measure of fairness. Victor scoffed under his breath. "So that is it. He walks in from the street and suddenly he is a saint?" Mason's gaze hardened. "No. He walked in from the street hungry and still refused to steal. You grew up surrounded by abundance and chose deceit. That is the difference." The staff exchanged uneasy glances. Even the cook, Mrs. Bello, who usually had a funny comment for every occasion, said nothing. Then Victor did something no one expected. He pointed at Gabriel and shouted, "Ask him who he really is. Ask why he carries a photograph of your dead son." The room froze. Gabriel stared at him. "What are you talking about?" Victor rushed into the staff quarters before anyone could stop him and returned holding Gabriel's faded family photograph. He must have found it while planning the watch. Mason snatched it from his hand. The color drained from the billionaire's face. The picture showed Gabriel as a small child between his mother and father. Gabriel's father was smiling, one arm around his family. Time had faded the image, but not enough to hide his face. Mason staggered backward. The man in the photograph was his son, Michael. For 22 years, Mason had believed Michael died after their final argument and the terrible car accident that followed. The police had found the wreckage, a burned jacket, and Michael's identification, but the body had never been conclusively recovered. Grief had supplied the answer. Evidence could not. Gabriel watched Mason's hands tremble. "Sir, why are you looking at my father like that?" Mason could barely breathe. "What was his full name?" "Michael Wellington Aidley. He used my mother's surname after they married." A sound escaped Mason that was half gasp, half sob. Victor looked equally shocked. He had expected the photograph to make Gabriel look suspicious. Instead, he had opened a door that should have remained buried for his own benefit. Mason whispered, "Michael Wellington was my son." Gabriel laughed once, but there was no humor in it. "That is impossible. My father never said he had a wealthy family." "Because he left me," Mason replied, "and I was too proud to find him before it was too late." Mason sank into a chair and told the story he had hidden for decades. Michael had been his only child, brilliant, stubborn, and deeply compassionate. Mason wanted him to join the family company. Michael wanted to become a doctor and open clinics for people who could not afford treatment. Their disagreement became a war of pride. On the night Michael left, Mason told him that if he walked out, he should never return. Michael walked out. Hours later, his car crashed near a bridge during a storm. Mason spent years punishing himself with the final words he had spoken. He built hospitals, funded scholarships, and donated millions anonymously. But none of it silenced his regret. Gabriel listened with tears gathering in his eyes. Pieces of his childhood suddenly rearranged themselves. His father had rarely spoken about his past. He had called himself an orphan and avoided photographs. Whenever Gabriel asked about grandparents, Michael would become quiet and change the subject. "He survived the crash," Gabriel whispered. "He had scars on his shoulder and back. He told me it happened before he met my mother." Mason covered his face. His son had lived and died years later, believing he was unwanted. The old billionaire began to weep openly. Not the controlled tears of a dignified businessman, but the broken sobs of a father who had just discovered that grief had lied to him for 22 years. Gabriel wanted to be angry. Part of him was. Here stood the grandfather who could have changed everything. His father's illness, his mother's suffering, the years Gabriel spent surviving alone. Yet as he watched Mason crumble, anger collided with compassion. Mrs. Bello finally broke the silence by handing Mason a tissue box. "Sir, please use these before you flood my clean floor. I just mopped it." A stunned laugh escaped Gabriel. Even Mason smiled through his tears. And for a few seconds, life returned to the unbearable room again. Victor, however, saw something else. His inheritance disappearing. If Gabriel was Michael's son, then he was Mason's grandson and possibly the rightful heir to everything Victor expected to receive. "This proves nothing," Victor said quickly. "A photograph can be manipulated. Names can be borrowed. He may have planned this from the beginning." Gabriel spun toward him. "I did not even know who Mason was when I came here. I asked for food, not a company." "Enough," Mason said. "We will conduct a DNA test. Until then, Victor, you will leave this house." Victor's face twisted with fury. "You are throwing away family for a stranger." Mason looked at Gabriel, then back at his nephew. "No, I am protecting someone you tried to frame. Blood does not excuse cruelty." Victor left, but the look he gave Gabriel promised that the fight was not over. 2 days later, the DNA test was arranged privately. During the wait, Mason showed Gabriel the greenhouse as it had looked when Michael was a child. Old albums revealed a laughing boy with Gabriel's eyes, Gabriel's crooked smile, and Gabriel's habit of tilting his head whenever he was confused. They laughed when Mrs. Bello pointed at a picture of young Michael covered in cake. "Your father tried to eat his 5th birthday before we could sing," she said. Gabriel smiled. "He once burned rice and told us it was smoked cuisine." Mason laughed so hard he had to sit down, but happiness carried pain inside it. Every new story reminded them of the years they had lost. That evening, Mason finally opened the envelope hidden behind the old photograph. The letter was from Michael. It had been delivered after the crash, but Mason had been too afraid to read it. His hands shook as Gabriel sat beside him. Michael had written that he was sorry for the argument. He explained that he loved his father, but could not live a life chosen for him. He promised to return when they had both calmed down. At the bottom of the page was one final sentence. "One day when I have a son, I hope you will teach him the things pride prevented you from teaching me." Mason pressed the letter to his chest. Gabriel looked away, overwhelmed. The following morning, the DNA results arrived. The probability of biological relationship was greater than 99.9%. Gabriel was Mason Wellington's grandson. The household erupted in tears and celebration. Mrs. Bello cooked enough food for what she called a small wedding and a medium-sized riot. The gardeners decorated the restored greenhouse. Even the security guard who had first opened the gate hugged Gabriel and whispered, "I knew there was something about you." For the first time since losing his parents, Gabriel felt surrounded by family. Mason made an announcement that afternoon. Gabriel would return to school, complete the education hunger had interrupted, and learn the family business only if he wanted to. Mason would not repeat the mistake he made with Michael by choosing another man's future for him. Gabriel couldn't decide between the family's business and medicine. He wanted to finish the dream his father had carried: affordable clinics for families who had nowhere else to go, and also help relieve Mason of the family business. Mason told him to take his time and would agree with any decision he made. It should have been the beginning of peace. At midnight, the silence inside Mason Wellington's study was broken only by the ticking of the antique clock. The DNA report rested on the desk in front of him. Mason's hands shook as tears filled his eyes. "My grandson," he whispered. With trembling fingers, Mason opened the faded envelope he had avoided for more than 20 years and read it again. He paused and took a sip of water from the glass on the table. Minutes later, Mason collapsed in his study. Gabriel found him on the floor beside a shattered glass of water. His lips were pale, his breathing dangerously shallow. As the ambulance raced toward the hospital, Gabriel held his grandfather's hand and begged him to stay awake. Mason managed only 4 words before losing consciousness. "Do not trust Victor." At the hospital, doctors rushed Mason into emergency care. Gabriel paced the corridor until a nurse approached. The laboratory had found traces of a powerful heart medication. Medication Mason had never been prescribed. Someone had tried to kill him. Then Gabriel's phone vibrated. A message from an unknown number appeared on the screen. "Leave the Wellington family tonight, or the old man will not survive the morning." Gabriel stared at the message as cold fear spread through him. Across the hospital corridor, a familiar figure stepped out of the elevator wearing a cap pulled low over his face. Victor had returned. Gabriel stood frozen at the end of the hospital corridor. Victor had returned. Their eyes met for only a second before Victor turned and disappeared around the corner. Gabriel immediately knew Victor had not returned to visit Mason. He had come to make sure the old billionaire never woke up again. Gabriel alerted hospital security and rushed back toward the intensive care unit. Doctors and nurses worked desperately to save Mason after the poison had attacked his heart. Gabriel could do nothing except pray outside the glass doors, remembering the day he had arrived at the mansion asking for nothing more than a plate of food. Victor slipped through a service corridor hoping to destroy the last evidence against him. What he did not know was that the mansion's security footage and the hospital cameras had already exposed his movements. Police officers quietly surrounded the exits. Hours later, the lead doctor finally emerged. "He's stable." Those two words brought Gabriel to tears. As relief filled the hallway, officers intercepted Victor near the hospital exit. Faced with the evidence, he confessed that jealousy and greed had consumed him. He believed Mason's fortune belonged to him and could not accept Gabriel becoming part of the family. Later that afternoon, Mason slowly opened his eyes. The first face he searched for was Gabriel. "You're still here." Gabriel smiled through tears. Family doesn't walk away. Mason squeezed his hand. Neither does love. Victor was arrested and taken away. Mason chose justice instead of revenge, refusing to let bitterness define the rest of his life. Over the next few months, Mason recovered fully. Gabriel made sure he had everything he needed, and on most afternoons they sat in the garden together and laughed over small talks. Weeks later, peace finally returned to the mansion. The laughter that had disappeared for decades returned to the dining table. Mason no longer ate alone. Gabriel insisted on earning every privilege. "I came here looking for work," he smiled. "Knowing who I am shouldn't change who I choose to be." Mason laughed proudly. "That is exactly why you deserve this family." Months passed. Gabriel learned every part of the family business from the ground up. He worked beside gardeners, drivers, cleaners, and office staff before ever stepping into the executive offices. Everyone respected him because they had watched his character long before discovering his true identity. One evening, Mason gathered the staff and his lawyer. "I'm not celebrating money today," he said. "I'm celebrating the family I thought I had lost forever." He officially recognized Gabriel as his grandson before everyone present, and Gabriel never disappointed him. Months later, the gate intercom buzzed. A frightened teenager stood outside wearing torn clothes. In a trembling voice, he asked, "Can I clean your house for a plate of food?" Gabriel smiled, remembering the day those same words changed his own life. He opened the gate. "No." The boy lowered his head. Gabriel gently placed a hand on his shoulder. "You'll eat first. Then, if you still want to work, we'll talk." From the balcony, Mason watched with tears in his eyes. "This house is finally a home again," he whispered. The end. If this story touched your heart, please like this video, subscribe, and share it with someone who believes kindness can still change lives. Tell us where you're watching from and the moment that touched you the most.